there, everyone, and welcome back to General Psychology right here on Canvas. So today we are going to be continuing our discussion on consciousness, and specifically altered consciousness. On Wednesday, we talked about sleep and how we're not conscious when we're sleeping, and today we're going to talk about how drugs alter our consciousness or our sort of self-awareness. To begin with, just a couple of announcements. Don't forget about the research requirement. Remember, you only have to do 4 credit hours of the research requirement to fulfill the requirement. On March the 30th, we're going to have an exam. The exam will be posted on Canvas for you to complete, and you'll have all day on Monday to complete the exam. On April 6th, we're going to have 2 assignments due. The first is going to be the addiction assignment, which we're going to talk more about today. And then also there's going to be a discussion board assignment due as well. So remember, with the discussion board, what I want you to do is answer one of my questions, post a question, and then either try to answer someone else's question that they posted or make a comment to their answer to one of my questions. Now, my purpose for doing the discussion boards is to keep you engaged within the course and to keep you communicating with myself as well as with everyone else in the class. And then my other purpose in doing this is the reason I'm having you ask a question is so that I can sort of see where it is that I was maybe not clear on maybe a certain topic. So daily review, this was a daily review due on Wednesday, the 25th. I wanted you to describe how both inattentional and change blindness may contribute to, say, a real world situation, like an automobile accident. So if you remember with inattentional blindness is when you are attending to one thing and you fail to miss a change in the environment, or you fail to miss something that you weren't expecting to occur. So maybe if in the case of an automobile accident, this is someone that's texting while they're driving, they're attending to their phone, and they miss an oncoming pedestrian. Now with change blindness, it's very similar. Both are instances to demonstrate that we're not conscious of everything in our environment. With change blindness, it's even when you are even searching for a change, you fail to notice it. So the example of this was like the engine in the picture of the airplane that was disappearing and reappearing. You were searching for it and it was potentially still really difficult to find. So that also tells you what the difference between change and intentional blindness is. Number 4, I wanted you to define priming. So remember, priming that we talked about in the first lecture on consciousness is exposure to a stimulus often will sometimes affect behavior to other stimuli. And an important aspect of priming is that it's unconscious. It's an instance where aspects or things that occur in our unconscious mind affects behavior. And I wanted you to provide a real world example of how priming may or may not have actually affected something that you did. Most of the examples that I provided when I went through priming were actually pretty negative. However, priming is not necessarily something that's always negative. It's just a lot of the research that's been done on this has focused on how activation of, say, stereotypes could influence people's behavior. But it could be something sort of more innocuous. It could be something like the type of music that was playing in a wine store influenced the type of wine that people bought, for instance. For today, the daily review that I would like for you to complete is, last time we were talking about sleep and various disorders with sleep. One of those disorders was sleep apnea. So in sleep apnea, an individual actually stop breathing while they're sleeping. They then awaken and immediately fall back to sleep. And this is an issue because, one, you stop breathing while you're asleep, And two, it actually keeps people from experiencing NREM 3 sleep or deep sleep, characterized by those low frequency delta waves, and REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep, which is a characteristic when you're dreaming. So what I want you to do is list up to 5 of the effects that we discussed in lecture or in your textbook that this lack of sleep could cause on someone, an individual with sleep apnea. But today, we are primarily going to be talking about drugs and consciousness, or how drugs can alter your consciousness. If you're more interested in learning about drugs, going above and beyond what we're talking about in this course, there's Psych 202. It's going to be taught next semester by Dr. Mary Kane. Psych 202 is drugs and behavior. I remember when I was an undergraduate student, I took a class called Drug Use and Abuse, and it was probably one of my favorite classes as an undergraduate student. I feel like I learned a whole lot about, not only about drugs, but also about the brain and consciousness from that class. So if you're interested, Psych 202 next will be offered in the fall. So to start off with some definitional terms, drugs are particularly psychoactive drugs. Drugs are any chemical substance that can alter perceptions or mood. Most drugs actually alter both perception and one's mood. An example of this may be alcohol, morphine, heroin, methamphetamine, or it could be as sort of innocuous as a Tylenol or a aspirin, which can alter how it is that you're feeling. To begin with substance abuse disorder. Substance abuse disorder is a very harmful disease. It's also a very prevalent disease. 1 in 25 adolescents, so teenagers, suffer from a substance abuse disorder. Looking at the age range, which is most of you and myself, 1 out of 7 people between the ages of 18 and 25, which is 3.4 million young adults, suffer from a type of substance abuse disorder. It's a very serious issue. I've provided you with several links here in the slides to some resources. If you yourself or maybe someone you know is suffering from a substance abuse disorder, here are some resources that you can click on, use to help them get treatment. Substance abuse disorder, it's characterized by 3 things: tolerance, withdrawal, and then addiction. So with tolerance, the idea here is that our brains, through continual use of a drug, will actually adapt to the drug. And the brain will basically, to maintain its homeostasis, will actually develop a way to sort of counteract the effect of the drug. But what that means is that individuals who are using drugs have to take more of the drug in order to have the same sort of effect as what maybe they used to have. So for example, say a heroin user used to be able to get really high on only, half a gram of heroin. Well, now due to tolerance and sort of build up of this tolerance, now they have to do, say, 2 grams of heroin to get the same sort of effects on them. Tolerance, substance abuse is also characterized by withdrawal. So withdrawal is basically when the drug is removed, the brain produces less of sort of the natural drug, and it actually can even create opposing sensations. So a good example of this is I usually drink coffee, and every single morning I start with a cup of coffee. And if I go without this coffee, I can actually experience some pretty bad headaches until I get my coffee fix. I experience that withdrawal, or sort of the harmful effects of not having the drug that I'm used to having, caffeine. Caffeine is also probably the most widely used drug in the world. Also with withdrawal, you can, a lot of times people experiencing withdrawal actually get the opposing sensation of what the drug actually produced in them. So for instance, a heroin user who does heroin every day, goes a week without the heroin, or even maybe even a day without the heroin, they can actually experience heroin. It calms people down, it reduces, suppresses muscle movements, and individuals experience withdrawal may actually experience jitters. Or for me, if I'm not having my caffeine that I'm used to having, which increases neural activity because caffeine's a stimulant, if I don't have the caffeine, I just feel very groggy throughout the day until I have it. So it's producing that opposing effect. And the last aspect of substance abuse disorder is addiction. Now, addiction is loosely defined as just continued drug craving and continued use of the drug despite its undesirable consequences. So despite the disruption that the addiction has in your life, you're still doing the drug, you're addicted to the drug. Most individuals that do suffer from a form of substance abuse disorder actually will say that they do not like the being addicted and they would love to quit the drug, they just can't. Here are sort of the definitions of the terms that I just outlined. Maybe take a minute to pause the video and write these definitions down. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so we talked about tolerance, which is basically that over continued use of the drug, more drug is needed to experience sort of the same effects. You used to get off on, maybe 1 gram of methamphetamine, and now you're having to do 2 grams to get that same effect. What I want you to do is take a moment and identify from these curves, these response curves, which either A here or B is representative of tolerance. So on the x-axis, we have the dose, the amount of the drug that you have to do as a function of the effect of the drug. If you guessed B, you are correct. A is actually sensitization. I'm going to struggle with this word. And basically what that is that means that you need less of the drug to experience the same effect. And both of these are at play in substance abuse disorder. So with tolerance, you have, at one point in time, you were able to take, say with the 1 gram of the methamphetamine to get the observed effect. But now you have to take 2 grams to get the same effect that you would originally only need 1 gram to get. With sensitization, what this is cases when you need less of the drug to get the same effect. This actually occurs oftentimes and actually leads to a lot of overdoses. Individuals that use, say, a drug like heroin can, let's say the person, they start off and their response curve to the, amount of the effect they get from the dose is represented by this darker line. When they first start off using the drug, over time using the drug, they build up a tolerance. So now they're this light blue line that was represented in B here. And a lot of times what happens is that individuals that have built up this tolerance to, say, heroin, whenever they come off the drug, say they go to rehab, they get clean, they return to the drug. Well, the last time they did the drug, they needed 2 grams to get, high. However, now, because they've been off of it, they actually can sensitize to the drug, where they end up doing the 2 grams, say here, and now they're experiencing this whopping effect of the drug that can actually lead to an overdose. Other examples of when we may sensitize to drugs, let's say you like to have a beer and you drink beer typically, say, at home on your couch while watching television. Well, let's say, or maybe in Aggieville. You go out to Aggieville, you have a beer. That's usually where you drink beer. Well, let's say you go to a new town or a new location, maybe a new bar in Aggieville, and you can actually have cases where people will sensitize to the alcohol, where they're used to experiencing it in one environment. You change the environment of where they're actually taking the drug and are ingesting the alcohol, and it can have a much stronger effect on you. So that's tolerance. Next, we're going to be talking about sort of drugs in the brain and the three different sort of classes of drugs. So if you recall, we discussed when we were talking about biology and the biological foundations of behavior that neurotransmitters is what, or is how neurons in the brain communicated with one another. So if you remember neurons, brain cells, they transmit action potentials down their axons. They release neurotransmitters at the axon cleft, and those neurotransmitters is what travel across the synapse, bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, causing the next neuron to fire. I showed this slide before when we discussed biology. We have a postsynaptic neuron here. It sends its action potential, passes neurotransmitters, these little chemicals, to postsynaptic neurons. So presynaptic, postsynaptic, these little chemicals bind to receptors, making the next neuron fire. And drugs operate a lot of times at this level of these neurotransmitters. So drugs can usually either be agonists, which is where they mimic the neurotransmitter, causing the next neuron to either fire or potentially, rather than fire, inhibit the neuron from firing, or they can act as antagonists or actually blocking the receptor site so that the neurotransmitter from the presynaptic cell can't bind to the next cell, making it to where it's less likely to fire. And the different classes of drugs and different types of drugs actually operate on these neurotransmitters, at the level of these neurotransmitters. Oftentimes it's either agonists or antagonists. There are three classes of psychoactive drugs. These classes are hallucinogens, such as marijuana, LSD, stimulants, such as caffeine, the most commonly used drug in the world. Stimulants may be methamphetamine, cocaine as well. And then there are depressants. The depressants are going to be the opioids, the barbiturates, codeine is a depressant. So three classes: hallucinogens, stimulants, depressants. And we're going to go through each of these three individually. The first, hallucinogens. Hallucinogens are going to distort perceptions and evoke sensory images, potentially even in the absence of sensory input. You can put an individual who has taken a hallucinogen in a dark room and they'll still experience these hallucinations, maybe very visual, and even involve sometimes a lot of auditory information in their perception, even though they're not actually experiencing anything in their environment. They're in a dark room. These are also oftentimes known as the psychedelics. This is not a comprehensive list of hallucinogens. This is just sort of a smaller, some of the most common hallucinogens that people do, these psychedelics. Mescaline is one, or mescaline. It is a chemical that's found in the peyote plant, which is just a flower that grows in the desert. This was popular, especially like in the 1960s. There's LSD. This was also really popular in the 60s, and it's still used. LSD was actually created in a laboratory by a scientist who had accidentally ingested some of it, and on his bicycle ride home experienced a trip or a psychedelic experience. Marijuana is interestingly categorized in the hallucinogens. Marijuana contains THC, which increases sensitivity to colors, sounds, tastes, and smells. It disinhibits and produces a euphoric high. And importantly, it can impair motor memory functioning. So I know right now there are a lot of states who are operating to or pushing to legalize marijuana. The research on marijuana I'm going to talk about next is very mixed. Some reports say that or have found very strong correlations between individuals who use marijuana and impairments in executive functioning. So executive functioning would be the ability to attend and problem solve. And importantly, these correlations are found even when people are not using the marijuana. So the marijuana user, while they're using it, is going to experience impaired motor and memory functioning. They're not going to be able to attend to something very well. They're going to forget very easily. They have lack of short-term memory. However, there is some research suggests that those impairments of executive functioning could be long-lasting even when you're not high on the drug. Other reports are actually very mixed. And one of the reasons for this is that the research on marijuana is not very vast, which is interesting because that's the drug that a lot of people are suggesting that we legalize. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done on marijuana. DMT, this is another psychedelic. It's often is very club drug. And the neurotransmitters that these hallucinogens really operate on are going to be serotonin and dopamine. So if you remember from when we talked about biology, serotonin and dopamine are associated with happiness. They're involved in mood regulation and making you happy. One of the definite aspects of marijuana that research does support is that, and it's very consistent in the research, is that marijuana, one, impairs memory, as I mentioned. It's associated with lung damage, especially if you're smoking it. It's actually worse than cigarettes if you're smoking it, and if you're ingesting it by inhaling it. There's also an increased risk of psychological disorders in marijuana users. So there's, of course, research is correlational, which means we can't imply causality from the correlation, but individuals with lots of different types of psychological disorders, for instance, schizophrenia, for sure, has a link to marijuana use. Individuals with schizophrenia are more likely than individuals who are not diagnosed with schizophrenia to use marijuana. Also, marijuana, it is going to affect emotions. So if an individual is very happy whenever they're using the marijuana, marijuana will sort of exaggerate or exacerbate that emotion. If you are happy before you use marijuana, you're going to be happy whenever you're using it. If you're in a depressed mood before you use the marijuana, it can actually make you even more depressed. So some notes on the hallucinogen marijuana. The next type of drug, the next class of drug, are the stimulants. The stimulants, like caffeine, they're going to increase your neural activity. They're going to speed your body functions. They're going to raise blood sugar. They're going to increase your heart rate. They're going to cause lots of feelings of alertness. They're going to make you have a more positive mood, and they can even increase your confidence. They excite, they speed, they get you awake, keep you awake. There are lots of different types of stimulants. Coca-Cola originally had cocaine in it. Now they've replaced the cocaine with caffeine, which is just another stimulant. Coffee is a stimulant. Methamphetamine or crystal meth, also known as ice, is another stimulant. Methamphetamine is a very, very debilitating drug. Ecstasy is a club drug. And also, interestingly, with stimulants, There's Adderall and Ritalin, which Adderall and Ritalin are used to treat ADHD. They're used which is interesting because attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is defined as, a deficit in attention, the inability to concentrate. However, there's something interesting here where it seems stimulants are having this reverse effect on those individuals with ADHD, where actually giving them the stimulant and it's actually helping them concentrate more. Adderall is oftentimes used in the college population, and so is Ritalin, for when you're need to stay up all night to study for exams. I do not recommend the use of Adderall for that effect. Don't use it unless you're prescribed it for a specific problem. Also, I know Austin had asked a question about an ADHD medication earlier in the semester, and we did talk about biology. My goal was to originally include it in here as well and say something more about it and the neurotransmitters that it operates on. However, I wrote it down on a piece of paper and it's in my office, and I am unable to get to campus to get to my office to get that piece of paper. So I'm very sorry for not including it right here when this is the instant that it is that I wanted to include it. So I apologize for that. The third class of drug that we're going to talk about is depressants. Depressants are going to be the barbiturates, the opioids, the codeines, those drugs that are going to slow the brain function. They're going to slow the pulse rate and breathe in. They have pretty much the opposite effect as your stimulants. Rather than raising blood pressure, they lower blood pressure. Cause fatigue, dizziness, slurred speech. And also with the depressants, as well as with the stimulants, they're both very, very highly addicting. They operate on serotonin, dopamine. Stimulants are going to operate on glutamate. Many of the depressants are going to operate on GABA. Glutamate is the neurotransmitter that's involved in its sort of role is to make neurons fire more or excite neurons. GABA actually has the opposite effect. And chemically, they're very similar. GABA, instead of exciting the neuron, it actually inhibits the neurons from firing. The depressants, as I mentioned, include all your opioids. So things like Oxycontin, Vicodin, fentanyl, which is very popular and frequently abused now, morphine and heroin. Also note that some of these drugs are actually drugs that, while they are often used or can be used illegally and for recreational purposes, some of these drugs are actually, most of these drugs actually, are prescribed by physicians. So just because it's a drug doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. The endorphins, the opioids operate on the neurotransmitters endorphin, and there's actually multiple types of endorphins. Endorphins are primarily involved in inhibiting pain responses, which is the reason why these are administered or recommended by your physician. Doctors can prescribe these drugs. They also operate like the hallucinogens on serotonin, happiness. And I have a photo here of an individual with a drug addiction who is injecting the drug intravenously. They will often be characterized by these sort of track marks. Intravenous injection, you can inject morphine, of course, heroin intravenously. Some people will melt down the pills, the Oxycontin pills, and inject that intravenously. You can also inject methamphetamine and crack cocaine intravenously as well. Now, the last drug that I want to talk about is alcohol, because it is so prevalently used and because it's very in terms of substance abuse disorders, it's very widely used by people 18 to 25. So you may have experienced this yourself or seen this, where low doses of alcohol can sort of enliven a drinker and make them more social, make them more talkative. So maybe it's the case that alcohol could operate as a stimulant. Or do you think that alcohol operates as a depressant? Interestingly, alcohol is not a stimulant. Alcohol is a depressant, even at lower levels. The reason why it makes people more social when they drink alcohol, one of the ideas is that what it's doing is it's actually slowing sort of neurons and firing of neurons in the frontal lobe. So remember, the frontal lobe, it's important for decision making and inhibition. And by slowing that frontal lobe, it's making people more or less inhibited, so that they're more social, they talk more. But alcohol is definitely a depressant. I had this graph earlier in the semester when we talked about biology. Alcohol primarily operates on GABA, which is primarily involved in inhibiting neurons. This is some work that was actually done at Kansas State University, where they gave male and female rats either saline, which is water, or water mixed with ethanol or alcohol. And what you see here is that when the rats were given the alcohol and the green bars, they had more GABA neurons than if they were just given water, which suggests that, well, these drugs are operating on that neurotransmitter GABA. And specifically what alcohol does is it makes it to where the neurons are producing more GABA. And the neurotransmitter again, GABA. Alcohol has very detrimental effects on memory. You'll have individuals who drink, especially a lot of alcohol, will experience blackouts where they don't remember anything. So if you're trying to remember something, do not drink alcohol. Here we have, there was a painter who did several self-portraits while taking and ingesting different types of drugs. And I put this in the slides because you can sort of see what it is, the drug that he was using at the time when he was making the self-portraits. So if you can take a guess as to what drug this is based upon what it is that you know about the drug and what it does. This drug, if you guessed it was a hallucinogen, you are correct. He was on LSD. In this photo, this is also another hallucinogen. This is marijuana. You can see very vibrant colors. Again, marijuana, you are sensitive to more sensory stimuli like light and sounds. And you can see lots and lots of colors, and this person was very happy when he was making his self-portrait. The two types of drugs that's used that he was on here are methamphetamine on the right, so stimulants, and cocaine on the left. You can see that in comparison to the previous photo, there's lots and lots of activity in these self-portraits, which makes sense because stimulants are going to increase neural activity. So he's drawing a lot more. This is another instance of where he was on a stimulant. This is Ritalin. Ritalin is commonly used to treat ADHD. See, again, lots and lots of activity, lots of lines, lots of drawings on stimulants. This last one, this is, if you take a guess, it is a depressant. You can see that there's less lines than there were when he was doing Ritalin, which is a stimulant. Lots of vibrant colors again, and this is the drug morphine. So the effects of a drug is determined by two different things. One, it's determined by its biological effects that it has on your brain, the actual neurotransmitters, the brain regions that the drug operates on. Drugs are also, the effect that the drug has can also be determined from your expectations about what it is that the drug is going to do to you. Lots of research has been done on expectancy effects and how it is that an individual who expects the drug is going to have this effect, it's going to cause that effect in them. This research is really interesting, especially with the alcohol research that's done on this, because what they do, it's very creative, I think. What they do is they will give individuals like mixed drinks, and in the placebo, which is placebo, if you recall, is when people think they have the drug, but they actually don't have the drug. In the placebo condition, what they'll do is they'll actually take a little bit of alcohol and put it around the rim of the cup. So it's not enough to actually affect them biologically. It's just enough for them to still get that scent and make them think that it is that they're actually ingesting the alcohol. I heard a story from a professor here at K-State who does research in social psychology, and he said that he actually was an experimenter in an experiment where people thought they had alcohol, and he gave this person in the experiment a placebo, which was like orange juice that had a little bit of alcohol on the rim of the glass to produce that same sort of smell. And the fire alarm actually went off in the building to where they had to evacuate the building. And he said that this individual who thought they had actually ingested the alcohol was like stumbling and slurring their speech and everything, and was like refusing to leave the building during this fire alarm. And the professor had to actually tell the person, like, no, you actually have not had any alcohol. And then after he told him that, the person like that just bounced back from acting ridiculous and started acting normal again. So the effect that it can actually have is actually influenced a lot from your expectations. So in research study, men who are told they have consumed alcohol are more likely to report having strong sexual fantasies and feeling guilt-free after watching an erotic movie. So they expected the alcohol would have this effect. They actually didn't have any alcohol, but they still attributed their feelings towards, or their lack of guilt towards, the alcohol they believed they had. Also, research has demonstrated that bad trips on hallucinogens is when you have scary hallucinations, are caused by the current mood and expectations. So if an individual thinks they're going to have a bad trip on a drug, they do the drug, they're more likely to have the bad trip. Now, last thing, there are 3 theories of addiction. So a lot of people actually take drugs and get addicted in the first place. These are not mutually exclusive, but there are 3 different approaches that have been used to explain drug addiction. The first is the physical dependence theory. This is the idea that people take drugs to alleviate their withdrawal symptoms. So the individual is addicted, they don't want to be on the drug, however, they experience withdrawals when they don't use the drug, therefore they continue to use the drug, which leads them to more tolerance and stronger withdrawal symptoms once they quit using it. An issue, though, of course, with this theory you may think of is that it doesn't actually explain why people do drugs in the first place. Number 2, the positive incentive theory. The idea here is that drugs are taken because you expect them to have very pleasurable effects. You expect, I'm going to smoke this drug and I expect that I'm going to feel good after ingesting it. I feel good after ingest it, so I'm going to continue to use it. Number 3, there's the disease model of addiction. The idea here is that addiction is like a disease. And in support of this theory, in support of this model, there does seem to be this sort of genetic predisposition for some individuals to become addicted and others not to become addicted once they actually try a drug. However, of course, who we are not only because of biology or genetics, we're also who we are because of environments. And one of the ideas of epigenetics we talked about earlier in the semester is that environmental events can actually trigger on and off whether or not you experience the phenotype of the gene, or the activation of the gene that actually expresses the behavior is environmentally triggered. So to recap, we talked about what drugs are. We talked about substance abuse disorder. We talked about the 3 classes of drugs: hallucinogens, stimulants, and depressants. And we talked about the 3 theories of addiction. So to finish the lecture today, I wanted to talk just a moment about the addiction assignment. And I apologize for this lecture going longer than what it is that I initially planned, but I needed to at least also cover this assignment. So if you go onto Canvas under modules, there are the lectures here. And below that is a whole section for assignments. And there's the addiction assignment due on April 6th. So my purpose in having you complete this assignment is to give you the experience of actually simulating an addiction, where your addiction, your drug of choice, is ice cubes. So for instance, maybe you were able to fulfill your addiction at one point in time just from drinking water. However, now you have to have a very special type of water, and that is crystallized water or ice cubes. And for 48 hours, so for 2 days, waking hours, every single time you take a drink of something, put an ice cube in it. So even if it's you're drinking milk or drinking coffee, if you're drinking from a can or drinking from a bottle, every time you take a drink, you need an ice cube. However, ice cubes are going to be socially unacceptable and illegal. So do not talk about this with people outside of individuals who are also participating in this exercise. And for every hour, waking hours only, what I want you to do is I want you to keep a log. Write, are you thirsty now? Where's your next ice cube coming from? So this is to simulate the addiction of an individual who is craving the drug and doesn't necessarily always know or have planned out where it is that I'm going to get the drug the next time I need to get high. And what is your plan of actually satisfying your cravings? This assignment is going to be much more easier now that everyone is hopefully staying at their homes. However, I still want you to sort of simulate this addiction, and I want to hear your thoughts about this assignment. So at the end of it, I want you to submit your log, your hourly log. You could do this in Microsoft Word, Excel, whatever's convenient for you. And I also want you to write sort of what it is that your thoughts, your feelings, and your reactions to this exercise. What is it that you're experiencing while you're performing this exercise? I'm also going to be doing this exercise myself over the weekend. And at the very end, I want you to consider the different models of drug addiction. So those 3 things that we talked about at the very end of the last lecture, the 3 theories of drug addiction. I want you to consider those models, incorporate those models into your reactions for this assignment so that you're applying what it is we talked about in lecture to something in the real world. My other purpose for having you do this assignment is to sort of help you realize that addiction is very debilitating, and it hopefully will sort of garner in you some sympathy towards individuals who are addicted to drugs. So with all that being said, I will close out everything. I hope everyone remains healthy. And next week, we're going to be, on Monday, we're going to have the exam. And on Wednesday and Friday, we are going to be discussing personality. So I will see you next time. And I hope everyone stays healthy and stays indoors, stays safe. See ya.